Hey guys, tonight we drift back in time, not to the violent Viking raids you've probably heard about, but to something far calmer, weirder, and honestly, smellier. Imagine this: the pale northern sky is thick with mist, the air tinged with the scent of pine smoke and brine, and somewhere in the background, someone is definitely boiling seal fat. You're standing at the edge of a fjord in what's now Norway, or maybe Iceland. In front of you is a longship, not majestic and speeding through waves, but tilted slightly on dry land, creaking as a gang of grizzled, bearded people argue over a crack in the hull. Their tools are simple, the wind is relentless, and that crack? That could mean the difference between sailing to glory or sinking in frigid waters. You probably won't survive this era. Let's be honest. You'd freeze by noon or offend someone's goat and get tossed overboard by sunset. But luckily, you're just here to fall asleep. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me where in the world you're listening from, and what time it is right now. I always love reading that. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The harbor you're in isn't just a pretty sight, it's functional, gritty, and alive with sound. Wooden ramps creak as they're hauled beneath the weight of ships being repaired. Somewhere to your left, a boy tries not to cry as he drops a hammer into the icy water. The boat builders around him laugh, not cruelly, but knowingly. Everyone drops a hammer eventually. You can smell a fire, low, steady, probably with a blackened pot of tar simmering on top. Tar will come up a lot tonight. Get used to it. Viking ships weren't just battle wagons, they were lifelines. Trade, exploration, and even flirting all happened by boat. So when a ship needed care, it was serious business. First, they'd beach it, or, if they were lucky, haul it into a small dry dock carved into the rocky coast. The keel, that central spine of the ship, was sacred. Break that, and you're looking at weeks of grumbling labor and possible goat-based sacrifices. Probably. Historians still argue whether actual ritual goats were used in ship repair ceremonies or if that's just saga-style drama. While the keel was checked for splits, the hull got brutal once over. Every plank had to be tight, overlapping, and sealed. These were nailed together like modern boats. They used clinker-built construction, each board overlapped the next, like the scales on a fish, or a very wooden dragon. The seams, of course, leaked. So what did they do? They greased them. With what? Animal fat. Seals if they were near the ocean, cows or sheep inland. Sometimes they even mixed it with ash or tar. It was disgusting. Effective, but disgusting. You watch one older man, he's shirtless, for no reason, in the middle of winter, slathering what looks like lard into a lawn seam with a lump of wool wrapped around a stick. He mutters to himself, the way your grandpa did when trying to fix the kitchen sink. And the smell? It's something between wet fur and last week's stew. You can almost feel your nose hairs curling. It wasn't all about plugging leaks, though. The hull needed smoothing too. Sandstone was used to polish the wood so that water flowed cleanly across it. It didn't just make the ship faster, it made it feel alive. Sailors believed that a smooth hull made the sea spirits happier. Or, at least, less murderous. Nearby, a teenage girl, yes, women were involved in this work too, not just in weaving sails but in patching, shaping, and arguing, is scraping barnacles off the bottom of a hull. She curses each one like it insulted her personally. Her scraper is just a chipped shard of whalebone, but it works. Her little brother is using a blunt rock and not having quite the same luck. What's interesting is that even with all this grueling work, they weren't obsessed with perfection. If a patch held, it held. If a board was warped, just wedge a chunk of leather next to it and pretend it was fine. Did it leak slightly? That's what bailing buckets were for. In a weird way, Viking ships weren't flawless, they were resilient, adaptive, living things. They breathed, swelled with water, grown with age. And the Vikings learned to listen to that. Historians still debate how often these repairs were needed. Some argue that a well-maintained ship could sail for years without major issues. Others point to old ship burials, where structural flaws suggest that even beloved ships were eventually too broken to fix. Maybe those flaws were why they were buried, honorably retired like old warriors. You hear a dog bark, and somewhere behind you, a baby cries. The world is noisy, cold, and hard, but there's something comforting about how everyone knows what to do. Each pair of hands has its task. The rhythm of scraping, pounding, and chanting fills the harbor like an old lullaby. The sea waits, indifferent and hungry, but the ships, they're getting ready. You lean closer now, watching a squat wooden bucket being passed along a line of rough hands. It's filled with something shiny, thick, pale, and faintly yellow. Animal fat. Rendered seal blubber, to be precise. And yes, it smells exactly like you think it does. A mix of fish market dumpster and grandma's candle drawer, if grandma was a Norse hunter with a fondness for evisceration. That fat isn't just for cooking. It's sacred stuff around here. Vikings figured out early that fat repels water better than just about anything else they had. It also seeps into the wood grain, keeping it supple, preventing it from cracking in cold weather, and helping it endure the lashings of salt, sleet, and time. So they'd slather it on like ancient boat surgeons, working it into every seam and plank. The process was called greasing the seams, and it wasn't for the faint of nose. You imagine the heat of the fat rising in curls of vapor, mingling with the tar smoke and the sharp scent of pine resin. It's both comforting and nauseating, like someone trying to bake cookies in a fish shack. The workers wore simple wool tunics, but no gloves, just calloused fingers, blackened nails, and decades of knowing exactly how to keep a ship alive with their hands. There's a rhythmic squish-scrape-squish as one man smears the fat along a joint with what looks like a goose feather dipped in soot. Another stirs the fat pot beside the fire, muttering about how the last batch was better because the seal was happier. You pretend not to notice the skull hanging above the fire pit, strung up with beads and what might be a tooth. It wasn't just for sealing either. They used fat to coat ropes, tools, even shoes. Sometimes it was mixed with beeswax or pine tar to make a more durable substance called smithsmurning, literally smith's grease. Historians still debate whether this stuff was always used on ships or more for blacksmithing, but either way, it ended up smeared on nearly everything. You hear someone joke that if the boat ever sinks, they could just eat their way back to shore. It's only half a joke. This was a time when utility trumped everything. If a fat-sealed seam meant the difference between floating to Britain or sleeping with cod, you got very comfortable with strange textures and worse smells. There's also a weird pride to it. You spot a young apprentice carefully measuring fat onto a seam with a bit of carved bone. His mentor barks at him, too much, too fast, like trying to butter a goat with a hammer. The kid rolls his eyes but adjusts. Craft mattered. Even when it was invisible. Especially then. You can't help but think about the logistics. Where did they get all this fat? Hunting, mostly. Seals in the coastal areas, pigs and cows inland. In especially lean winters, they'd trade for it. Viking merchants traveled with barrels of grease alongside furs, amber, and iron. It was heavy, rancid, and vital. Some sources even suggest that fat was used in emergency repairs mid-voyage. Picture this. You're in the middle of a storm off the coast of Scotland, your hull groans like it's having second thoughts, and you and 3 other drenched lunatics are spooning lukewarm seal lard into a crack by firelight. You wouldn't survive. No one would. And yet, somehow, they did. There's a fringe theory, historians still argue whether it holds any real merit, that some crews used the fat for ritual purposes, too. Maybe an offering to Njord, the sea god. Maybe to keep sea spirits out of the bilge. Maybe just to justify why they smelled like old soup for 6 months straight. Even the ship itself responded to the fat. The wood darkened and gleamed. Water rolled off in beads. On sunny days, the smell intensified, and the hull shimmered like a roast left in the sun. If you were lucky, you got used to it. If you weren't, you just held your breath and bailed faster. Back at the harbor, you now notice the ships lined up side by side. The older ones sag a little, patched so many times they look like quilts made of splinters. But they float. That's all that matters. No one here expects perfection, only durability. Beauty, if it exists, lies in how many winters a ship survives. The more scars, the more stories. A nearby boy slips on a glob of fat and lands flat on his back. Everyone laughs. Even the elders. It's not cruel, it's part of the rite. You don't really know a ship until you've bled on it, slipped off it, and spent a week scraping it with your teeth clenched. You move on toward a storage shed made of upright planks and seaweed-packed chinks. Inside, more barrels. More fat. More proof that these people didn't just use ships, they built their lives around keeping them alive. Boats were family. Floaty homes. Trading posts. Escape routes. And sometimes, when the wind was right, legends. Outside again, a squall rolls in. The wind turns wet and sharp. People start covering tools, pulling tarps, brushing fat into place faster, like surgeons finishing up before the storm hits. No one panics. They've seen worse. But the sea is watching now. The sky darkens, the boats gleam slick and strange, and the smell of rendered blubber hangs in the air like a lullaby made entirely of regret. The rain arrives not as a downpour, but as a slow, spiteful mist, one of those damp, determined types that soaks you through even while pretending it's no big deal. You tug your cloak tighter, or you would if you had one, and squint out toward the gray waterline where something unnatural bobs in the waves. Not a fish. Not a log. No, this is the stuff of Viking nightmares, a shipworm. It's not an actual worm, really, it's a marine mollusk, more like a hideous underwater termite. Soft-bodied, but armed with tiny, rasping shells it uses to chew its way through wood. Vikings feared them like you'd fear a termite the size of your forearm, which, incidentally, is about how big some of them got. And they didn't just show up in tropical waters. The North Sea had its own species, sneakier and colder. You crouched beside one of the younger shipwrights who's lifting a rotted board from the underside of a beached longship. The wood crumbles in his hands. It's pocked with tiny tunnels, like some deranged beaver tried to write poetry in Morse code. He spits into the grass and mutters a word that definitely isn't flattering. Shipworms were the invisible enemy. They'd burrow deep into the wood, hollowing it out from the inside until entire planks snapped under the pressure of a sharp wave or an unlucky oar. Imagine sailing to raid an English village and sinking halfway there because your boat turned into Swiss cheese. Not exactly heroic. So what did they do? Well, they got creative. One method involved lining the hull with animal hair and tar between the planks, a kind of primitive insulation that discouraged the worms. Others would apply thick, pitch-like layers of resin. Some even argue that Vikings avoided warmer harbors entirely when possible, preferring colder waters where shipworms were less active. There's also a record, historians still debate its accuracy, suggesting that some shipbuilders used woven wool soaked in pine oil, wedged between layers of wood. If true, it's basically the ancient Norse version of double-glazed windows. It made the ship heavier, sure, but it might have saved it from being eaten alive mid-voyage. You watch as the older builder examines the damage. He taps the rotted plank, then gestures for a younger man to bring a fresh board. The new timber is pale, freshly carved, and smells like clean forest. It's about to become part of a vessel that might carry warriors, merchants, or dreams. First, though, it needs a good slathering of seal fat and maybe a prayer or two. There's a moment of silence as the old plank is tossed aside and the new one fitted. It's a respectful pause, not for the board, but for the dozens of hours that went into shaping it. Every nail, every curve, every hidden seam was someone's work. Now it's gone, too damaged to matter. The sea eats what it wants. One of the more eccentric crew members swears he saw a shipworm crawl across a dock once, its pale body writhing like a curse in motion. No one believes him. But everyone listens. Nearby, someone taps a thin iron rod along the hull, listening. It's a trick passed down for generations. You rap gently with metal and listen for changes in tone. Hollow spots sing differently. It's the Viking version of a CT scan. No fancy tools. Just ears, rhythm, and intuition. Another trick? Fire. Not for burning, but for drying. You recall an older builder who'd once heated an iron cauldron and hovered it under the hull's belly to drive out moisture. Sometimes the heat would also scare out pests. Of course, sometimes it just started small, alarming fires. But hey, nothing says ship maintenance like the smell of singed wool and panic. Still, despite all these efforts, shipworm infestations happened. When they did, the ship had two options: quick repair or slow death. Viking pragmatism meant that sometimes, whole sections of hull were ripped out and replaced in a single day. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't clean. But it worked. And through it all, the ships kept sailing. You step back now, watching the fresh board go into place. It fits with a satisfying thunk, like a puzzle piece finding its home. There's no cheer. Just quiet satisfaction. A job done right. One more defense against the crawling hunger of the sea. A little girl, no older than 6, wanders by with a wooden doll shaped like a longship. She pretends to chase away shipworms with a stick. Everyone smiles. Maybe she'll build ships someday. Maybe she'll command one. Or maybe she'll just remember the smell of seal fat and the sound of iron tapping wood and tell her children stories no one else will believe. That's the thing about Viking life. It wasn't all battles and beards. It was maintenance, adaptation, and constant vigilance. And for every sword raised in war, there was a barrel of tar heated slowly by the harbor, warding off enemies too small to see. The rain eases. The mist thickens. And the harbor breathes a little easier. At least for now, the shipworm has been held at bay. You return the next morning, or maybe it's just later the same gray day. Who can really tell around here? The sky is the color of dirty wool, and the air smells like smoke, salt, and something a bit metallic. You follow the sound of rhythmic hammering toward a circle of men hunched over buckets of glowing coals. They're not forging weapons. Not today. These are ship nails, and they matter just as much. Viking nails were called spikar, and they weren't some lazy afterthought tossed in from the general iron pile. These were hand-forged, one by one, often by the same blacksmith who knew the shipbuilders personally. Every nail had a job, a place, a personality, even. Too long, and it splits the plank. Too short, and your hull creaks like a haunted door mid-voyage. Either way, someone ends up wet, and someone ends up dead, usually in that order. You crouch by the forge and feel the heat on your cheeks. The iron glows like molten sun, and the smell of charcoal makes your nose sting. A smith lifts a red-hot rod from the coals with tongs and lays it on an anvil with all the calm reverence of someone performing open-heart surgery. Clang. One hit to shape. Clang. One to flatten. Clang. A twist. Then a quick dunk into a barrel of water that hisses like an angry snake. These nails aren't shiny. They're rugged, blackened, slightly uneven. They don't match each other like factory-made clones. They're more like cousins, similar enough to do the job, but not above squabbling when under pressure. That's why they're driven in with care, often by the same carpenter who chose the planks. Wood and iron had to become friends, or at least agree to hate the sea more than each other. One of the younger men is sorting the cooled nails into leather pouches, counting under his breath. It's not just about numbers, it's about trust. Nails were expensive. In some cases, even traded as currency. A ship might need thousands. Some historians even argue that nails were a greater investment than the wood itself, depending on the size of the crew and how far the voyage would take them. There's even an old saga in which a man was murdered over a bag of nails. Not treasure. Not revenge. Just iron. Sharp, essential, and easy to disappear with if your conscience was already on vacation. You move toward a half-repaired longship, watching as nails are lined up on a wooden beam like tiny soldiers awaiting battle. A shipwright picks one, presses it into a pre-drilled hole, and then smacks it home with a wooden mallet wrapped in hide to prevent splitting. The wood groans, the nail sinks, and the hole exhales. Some nails are peened over on the inside, bent like a hook to hold planks together tighter. Others are left proud, with small iron washers underneath to spread the load. It's a system passed down by muscle memory, not textbooks. One mistake, and your patching leaks for months. Or explaining to your chieftain why his prized vessel now steers like a sick elk. To prevent rust, nails were sometimes soaked in oil or even rubbed with animal grease. Yes, more fat. At this point, if it couldn't be sealed, cleaned, or fed with fat, the Vikings probably didn't trust it. There are fringe theories that shipbuilders whispered blessings over the first nail hammered into a new ship. Not for good luck, just to tell the ship it was alive now. A beginning, like lighting a candle. You touch one of the new nails, still warm from forging. It's stubby, rough, and slightly curved. Imperfect. But it works. That's the Viking way. Don't aim for pristine, aim for persistence. You imagine sailing into a storm, the hull groaning, the wind howling, and these tiny nails, each barely thicker than a finger, holding the whole beast together. You'd better believe you'd want every single one of them hammered by someone who cared. A few of the older shipwrights chuckle as they pass around a curved nail, bent almost into a spiral. A gift from Loki, one jokes. It's useless now, except maybe as a beard ornament. They toss it aside. Someone else will probably use it to hang a cloak or scare a child. You spot a pile of rusted, old nails removed from the previous day's repairs. Some are twisted from being pulled. Others are snapped clean in half. Each one had a life, a place, a story. One nail may have held the plank beneath a warrior's feet as he crossed to England. Another may have rattled loose as a merchant fled a storm off the Shetlands. Now they rest in a forgotten heap, relics of voyages both epic and absurd. You hear someone nearby say, "Iron is a jealous thing. It bends when you rush it, cracks when ignored, sings when treated right." That's the whole boat, really. A living contradiction of water, wood, metal, and sheer human stubbornness. There's a moment of quiet as another batch of nails is plunged into the water. Steam rises, hisses, and then fades. Somewhere in the distance, the sea sighs against the rocks. And one nail, just one, is gently pressed into place, like a promise made of iron. The wind shifts, bringing with it a new scent, less tar, more wool. You follow your nose to the slope behind the harbor, where long, withered poles stretch across the grass like skeletal clotheslines. Draped over them are sails. Not bright, not crisp. These are movie sails. These are Viking sails, heavy, sagging, and reeking faintly of sheep. Viking sails weren't canvas or silk. They were painstakingly woven from wool, dense and oily, the kind that makes your fingertips itch just looking at it. Making one sail could take a year, maybe more. And that's assuming no goats ate part of it midway through. You run your hand across one in-progress panel. It's coarse, thick, and a little sticky. That's not rain. That's fish oil. And, let's be honest, probably urine. Vikings weren't shy about using whatever worked. To weatherproof the wool, they often soaked it in a blend of animal fats, fish oils, and fermented liquid that may or may not have once been someone's bathroom break. You're horrified, but also impressed. That sail would shrug off a storm better than a modern raincoat. Nearby, women sit on low stools, working fibers into strands with rhythmic finger rolls and quiet humming. Their spinning tools are simple, bone, wood, the occasional polished stone, but their hands are fast, practice. One flicks a spindle with her knee while eating dried herring from a cloth pouch. Multitasking, Viking style. They twist the yarn into thick, rope-like threads. These are then passed to the weavers, who work on upright looms taller than you. Each panel of sailcloth is a labor of both love and exhaustion. If a thread breaks, you retie it. If a warp warps, you ignore it and hope the sea doesn't notice. Some panels are dyed a muddy red or ochre, using crushed roots and plants. Others are plain gray, the natural color of the wool. Bright sails were rare, they faded fast anyway. But color could matter. Some sagas describe ships with boldly striped sails meant to announce strength or confuse enemies. Historians still argue whether those tales were metaphor or fashion statement. You watch as one woman tests a finished square of sailcloth. She flicks water onto it, then blows hard. The droplets scatter. She nods. Approved. That square will be sewn edge to edge with dozens of others, using thick gut string or even sinew. The whole thing will be massive, often over 70 square meters, and it will take 4 grown men to hoist it. And you? You'd be stuck below, bailing seawater and trying not to vomit. Sails weren't just cloth, they were engines. A properly angled sail could cut days off a voyage. But they were fickle. Too loose, and you crawl. Too tight, and you snap the mast. Vikings didn't have compasses or GPS. They had sky, sea, and sails, and they needed every one of them to behave. To keep sails flexible, they were sometimes rolled in ash or treated with milk mixed with ground lichen. No, really. There's a record of Viking shepherds experimenting with milk-based waterproofing. Whether it worked or just made the sails curdle in the sun is unclear. You're welcome to try it on your next camping trip. A teenage boy is tasked with scrubbing an older sail clean. He's using a stiff brush, rainwater, and a lot of cursing. The cloth slaps wetly against the stone basin, flinging droplets like an angry sponge. He pauses to gag, dramatically. Someone throws a piece of dried meat at him. He eats it without blinking. This is bonding. You notice something subtle, the weave pattern. Viking sails weren't random. They followed tight, repeating motifs, diamond, chevron, broken twill. These patterns didn't just look nice, they added strength, like bones in fabric. And maybe, just maybe, they made the sails a little magical. Some sagas hint at protective spells woven into the very threads. Historians still debate whether these were genuine beliefs or just bedtime stories with really weird yarn. One woman smiles as she stitches a corner. Her needle is boar bone, her thread looped through a hole in her belt. She sings softly about the sea not taking what's sewn with care. You can't tell if she's serious. You suspect it doesn't matter. That's the Viking mindset. Hedge your bets with superstition, hard work, and goat grease. You walk under the hanging sails now, ducking slightly as you pass. The wind lifts one just enough to brush your head. It's heavy, damp, alive. You imagine it full of wind, bellied out over the open ocean, snapping and groaning like a beast on a leash. It's hard not to feel a little reverent. One young boy tugs on the edge of a sail, trying to fold it alone. It flattens him. 2 others join in. They laugh, pile onto it, roll around until someone yells at them. But in the end, they fold it right. That sail might take them to Ireland, or Iceland, or back again, or not at all. But for now, it rests. Heavy, oily, and strangely beautiful. You're starting to notice a theme now. Everything in this place is sticky, smoky, or sharp, and occasionally, all 3 at once. As you meander back toward the heart of the shipyard, a fresh wave of scent slaps you across the face. It's smoky, but sweeter than tar. Earthier. More, pine syrup meets barbecue. That's your first clue, you're near the tar pits. These are bubbling black holes like in cartoons. Viking tar pits were humble, just shallow bowls dug into hillsides, lined with clay and leaf litter. The tar didn't ooze from the earth, it was coaxed, slow-cooked, like the world's worst soup. The recipe? Take a few dozen pine stumps, rich in resin and preferably dead for a year, stack them like angry Lincoln logs inside a dirt dome, light a small fire on top, and wait. The result is something between alchemy and disaster management. You need to maintain a low, steady heat so the stumps sweat up their oils without bursting into flame. Those oils trickle down into a channel, then into a buried jar or hollowed horn at the base. And what do you get? Liquid magic, pine tar. Sticky, waterproof, and flammable as regret. One elder tends to the pit like it's a sacred hearth. He pokes the dome gently, murmuring about draft angles and resin flow. Nearby, another man uses a wooden ladle to stir a bowl of cooled tar, testing its texture. It drips like molasses with commitment issues. Perfect. They called it chara, tar for sealing ships, preserving ropes, painting tools, even smearing on boots. One enterprising chieftain once used it to slick his beard into terrifying points before a diplomatic meeting. That's not a joke. It's a lifestyle. You watch as a fresh batch of tar is poured into a small wooden barrel, still steaming slightly. A boy hammers in the lid and slaps a carved rune into the side. That barrel's headed for the dock. It might coat a hole, mend a crack, or just be used to threaten whoever forgot to clean their tools. Vikings didn't invent pine tar, but they perfected its use. They figured out how different trees made different grades. Slow-grown alpine pine gave thick, almost chewy tar, good for holes. Coastal pines? Thinner tar, better for rope work. Some tar was even smoked twice over to make it last longer in storage. You're not sure who tested all these variations, but you suspect they didn't have a lot of hobbies. What's more impressive is how widely it spread. Barrels of tar were traded just like amber or walrus ivory. A well-tarred ship was like a passport. You could go further, stay afloat longer, and arrive less soggy than the competition. It was their version of a good suspension system. You wandered toward a group painting the underside of a longship. They're crouched low, faces smeared, brushes made of horsehair lashed to driftwood. They dip into steaming bowls and sweep the dark goo across the seams in long, practiced strokes. It looks meditative, until one of them drops his brush and curses loud enough to wake a mountain. Everyone laughs, except maybe the mountain. There's an almost artistic flair to how they apply the tar. It goes on in layers, one thin coat to seal, a second to smooth, a third to bless. Okay, maybe that last one isn't official, but one man does whisper something every time his brush meets wood. A habit? A prayer? A leftover superstition from his grandmother? Historians still argue whether these rituals were spiritual, practical, or just occupational tics. Like knocking wood, or humming while you stir paint. The tar isn't just brushed on. In colder months, it's heated in iron kettles and poured directly into deeper seams using carved wooden funnels. A risky move, tar burns. A single misstep and your ship's belly becomes a bonfire. You've never seen a man slap out flames with a wet sheepskin cloak before, but today's your lucky day. Once applied, tar transformed the ship's appearance. The wood turned almost black, glossy, intimidating, and it smelled like scorched pine needles and ambition. Even after sailing for weeks, the scent lingered. Sailors said you could smell a Viking ship before you saw it sail. Like a warning or an invitation, depending on how your last village visit went. Some crews even mixed tar with blood, goat, sometimes their own, claiming it made the seal stronger. There's no real proof it worked, but there's also no proof it didn't. And in a world where storms whispered in your sleep and sea monsters were only mostly imaginary, every extra bit of insurance counted. One builder, his hands black with resin, wipes his face and smears a bold stripe across his nose. A joke? A mark? Or maybe just a way to keep the bugs off? You ask, silently, how many ships he's seen sail off. How many came back? He shrugs. That's not for him to know. He just tars the holes. The sea decides the rest. You walk back to the edge of the tar pit. It bubbles lazily, the fire beneath it sighing. The air is thick with heat and history. A ship leans in the distance, its side freshly glossed, gleaming like midnight glass. It's not just waterproof now. It's seaworthy. It's ready. And somewhere deep in that hull, a drop of tar is still warm, waiting to be tested by waves, storms, and time. You blink the smoke from your eyes and squint across the harbor, where a new crew is unloading timbers from a rough-hewn cart. Long, straight logs, still fragrant with sap, still trailing bits of moss. These are ship bones. Raw pine, oak, and sometimes ash, destined to become ribs, keels, and masts. But not just any trees will do. Vikings were picky about their wood, despite living in a land where forests were mostly trying to kill them with root tangles and bare surprises. The ideal tree? Tall, slow-grown, with tight rings and a gentle curve that matched the hole's lines. A shipbuilder could stare at a tree for an hour, tap it with a knuckle, then just mutter nope. And keep walking. You follow one of the younger carpenters. He's barely more than a boy, but his axe is sharp and his stance says he's done this before. He rolls a log with his foot, squats, and eyes the grain like it owes him money. A nod. This one's a keeper. They'll split it lengthwise using wedges and mallets, revealing the sweet-smelling hardwood inside. But where did all this timber actually come from? That's where things get messy. Not every Viking settlement had great shipbuilding trees nearby. Coastal areas like western Norway were rocky, windblown, and frankly terrible for tall, straight trunks. So they imported, traded, stole, or, when politics got spicy, they raided a monastery and came back with both gold and a few good trees. Historians still argue whether most Viking ships were built entirely from local wood or whether long-distance lumber trade was more widespread. Some sagas mention ships made from southern oak, while others brag that a king's fleet used timber blessed by mountain spirits. Is that poetic license or shipping manifest? No one agrees. You glance toward a pile of discarded planks. Some are warped, twisted by age or weather. Others have been notched by accident, rendered useless. A boy tries to sneak one away for firewood, only to be swatted by a gray-haired carpenter who mutters something about wasting good curve. Around here, even a slightly bowed plank might someday become the perfect prow. One old man swears he can smell which tree will make the best mast. You believe him. He sniffs a bundle of pine, nods, and gestures for it to be set aside. Another argues that only wood felled during the waxing moon is worth anything. Yet another insists it's all about which direction the tree leaned in the wind. Whether those beliefs are true or just bark-soaked traditions, no one's brave enough to test the theory. They shape the wood using tools so old they might predate breakfast, broadaxes, adzes, draw knives. Every stroke is purposeful. No sandpaper here. Just the rhythmic hiss of iron on sapwood, and the soft plunk of shavings hitting wet earth. Some of the younger workers tie their hair back with strips of bark to keep it from getting caught. One girl sharpens a blade with a whetstone, her lips moving silently as she counts the passes. There's no need for measurement when you can feel it in your bones. And even when a log is perfect, it still needs time. Fresh wood is wet, springy, unpredictable. So it's often left to season under cover, stacked carefully to avoid warping. You walk past rows of planks like sleeping giants, waiting. Some are marked with chalk runes, dates, names, maybe warnings. It's like a graveyard for ships that haven't been born yet. Occasionally, builders would steam bend a plank by soaking it in hot water or burying it under compost for weeks. It softens the fibers just enough to coax a graceful curve. The smell? Oh, it's awful. Like someone boiled a swamp in a fish barrel. But the result is worth it, holes that glide, not lurch. And bones that hold tight even when the sea gets mean. There's one particularly large beam lying in the grass, too thick to move without help. Someone scratched a joke onto its side, stronger than Eric's promises. You don't know who Eric is, but you suspect he's been late to a lot of things. The respect for the wood runs deep. You hear a story about a shipbuilder who wept when his favorite oak split wrong. Not from sadness, but because the tree changed its mind. Another tale tells of trees that whisper at night, warning if they're not ready to sail. True or not, you notice that no one ever cuts wood without first pausing, hand on bark, like saying hello. As the day wears on, a mast takes shape, tall, straight, still damp from the rain but already proud. It's lifted slowly, lashed into place on a half-finished frame. It leans ever so slightly, just enough to catch the wind right. That lean? That's skill. Or luck. Or both. And when the sun dips behind the hills, what little sun there is, someone sets a small candle inside a hollowed knot of wood. It flickers, low and golden. A quiet blessing for tomorrow's work. And for the ship that doesn't yet know its name. The next time you pass by the ships, it's not the sails or the holes that draw your eye, it's the men crouched along the sides, hunched like toads on a cold rock, gripping long wooden oars and rocking in slow motion. They're not rowing yet, just practicing the rhythm. Back and forth, as if repetition could make the work any less backbreaking. You ease up to one of the boats, careful not to trip over a scattered pile of oarlocks, those U-shaped wooden brackets that hold the oars in place. They're greasy from tar and coated in thin shavings of dried salt. You watch as one boy, maybe 15, fumbles to fit an oar into place. It slips. He winces. An older man barks something in Old Norse, probably not a compliment. Rowing a Viking ship wasn't a job, it was a life sentence to blisters and sore ribs. Depending on the ship's size, there could be 10 to 30 oars on each side. Each are weighed as much as a good-sized child, and none of them were identical. Shorter ones in the front, longer in the back. You had to know your oar. You had to trust it. And you had to row for hours. 12 hours wasn't uncommon. Through rain, wind, hangovers, and possibly lice. If the wind failed or the sea got fussy, you just rowed harder. Sometimes in silence, sometimes in chant. You imagine that sound, dozens of wooden blades hitting the water in perfect sync, a low groan from the ship's belly, and the grunt of bodies aching but not stopping. Like a giant breathing through its teeth. Viking rowers weren't slaves, for the most part. They were warriors, merchants, farmers, whoever had a reason to be on that boat. And they were expected to row like their lives depended on it. Because often, they did. To keep pace, they used rhythm. A chant, a drum, or even just the steady beat of the helmsman tapping his foot. Some ships had a man who only kept rhythm, a human metronome with a voice like gravel and no patience for slackers. You spot a carved wooden drum hanging from the mast base. It's cracked, its head patched with animal hide, but it still thumps deep and slow when tapped. That sound would carry across the sea, across storms, across the minds of men rowing themselves into a trance. Rowing became meditation. Or madness. There's a fringe theory, historians still debate its likelihood, that Viking rowers used meat or mushrooms to dull the pain on long voyages. Not to get drunk, but to disconnect just enough to survive the grind. It might explain some of the stranger sagas, like the one where a crew rowed non-stop through a storm and claimed to have seen whales dancing with valkyries. Interpret that however you like. The benches weren't cushioned. They were planks. Maybe draped with a fur if you were lucky, or had bribed someone. Blisters were a given. Sores, calluses, even bone bruises. And if your hands bled, you were expected to just keep rowing. One tale speaks of a man whose hand split during a raid. He bit down on a leather strap and kept going. The reward? He didn't drown. That's Viking motivation. You move along the length of one half-finished ship, counting your ports, those square holes along the hull. Some are rough cuts still, edges splintered. One has a tiny carved face just above it. A joke, maybe. Or a reminder. That or port belonged to someone. Still does. The oars themselves are beautiful in their brutality. Long shafts of ash or pine, carved with subtle tapers and balanced for endurance. The blades are wide, flat, and darkened with pitch at the ends. Some even have slight hooks, designed to catch and hold against opposing waves. One oar is painted with red spirals. Another has a notch carved into it for every trip it survived. That one has 13. You try not to read too much into it. You imagine sitting there, hour after hour, hands raw, knees stiff, back screaming. The man in front of you smells like fish and disappointment. The sea won't calm down. The wind is taunting you. But you row anyway. Because the alternative is worse. And if you ever stop rowing without permission, well, let's just say there's a reason the benches have such good reach. One rower can easily clock another with the butt of his oar. You wouldn't be the first to end up in the bilge for resting your eyes. Sometimes, they rode through fog so thick you couldn't see the man next to you. Other times, the sun burned your skin into leather. But always, the rhythm carried you. Thump, dip, pull, breathe, repeat. You pause near one final oar, lying alone in the grass. It's cracked at the handle. Useless now. Someone has carved a single rune into the break. A goodbye. Or a curse. Or maybe just an inside joke between sailor and sea. The boy from earlier sits now on the edge of the ship, feet dangling. His hands are black with pitch. His shoulders sag, but his eyes are fierce. He's not strong yet, but he will be. This ship will teach him. And when it does, when he finds the rhythm, the grip, the calm and the burn, he'll know. He'll understand the silent pact made every time a Viking or kissed the sea. Now you're drawn to a different kind of chaos, a coiled jungle of ropes, nets, cords, and lines, all piled near a makeshift tent woven from sea-stained hides. It smells like mildew, salt, and old goat. Welcome to the ropeworks, where every knot, loop, and strand is either crucial to sailing or designed to trip you into a puddle. Viking ropes weren't synthetic, obviously. No nylon. No polyester. Just twisted fibers wrung from plants, animals, and sheer persistence. Mostly hemp, nettle, or flax. Sometimes horsehair. Sometimes goat hair. And sometimes, when the gods were bored, seaweed. Yes, seaweed. The coarser, dry kind could be braided into emergency cordage. You can thank the desperation of storm-drenched Norsemen for that little discovery. You crouch next to two women who are spinning rope by hand, pulling long fibers between palms and rolling them over their thighs in repetitive, meditative motion. Their hands are cracked, fingertips stained greenish-brown. One of them coughs and tells the other that last week's batch of hemp had fleas. They keep spinning. Each rope starts as a bundle of fine fibers, gathered, soaked, dried, and then twisted together tightly, clockwise for single strands, counterclockwise when combining multiple strands. This opposing twist gives the rope strength, flexibility, and, if done wrong, the uncanny ability to unravel at the exact worst moment. You spot a heavier rope nearby, thicker than your arm, stiff with salt and pine tar. That one's for anchoring, or hauling in nets, or possibly restraining someone who insulted the wrong jar of mead. It's frayed at one end, but still sturdy. Someone's woven in a few blue threads, not for decoration, but to mark its owner. Historians still argue whether rope making was primarily a male or female task in Viking society. Most agree it was communal. Whoever had the hands and the time did the work, especially during shipbuilding seasons, when rope became more valuable than almost anything else. Without rope, there's no sail rigging, no anchor line, no spare loop to tie around that one or that always wants to float away when you blink. Over by the dock, a young man is testing a freshly made rope. He wraps it around a boulder and leans back with all his weight. The rope stretches slightly but holds. Satisfied, he grins, then promptly falls into the mud. The others cheer. It's a ritual now. Beyond him, a group of older sailors are repairing a net with bone needles and more of that coarse, gritty cord. The net is massive, meant for hauling herring or, according to one man's tall tale, a sea beast with antlers. You nod politely and step back. But ropes weren't just functional, they were also spiritual. Some shipbuilders tied small knots into the rigging to catch good luck. Others braided hair, yes, human hair, into lines used for launching ceremonies. One fringe theory even suggests that ship captains carried weather ropes, supposedly knotted by witches to control wind. Loosen a knot, gain a breeze. Untie all three? Welcome to the storm of your life. You approach a length of rope hanging from a beam. Someone has carved tiny runes into the wood just above it. They look fresh. Maybe a prayer, or a warning. Or maybe someone just really hated that specific knot. Nearby, two children are playing with a looped coil, pretending it's a sea serpent. One gets tangled. The other declares victory. Everyone ignores them. Learning to live with rope is half the Viking childhood experience. Getting dragged by one? That's the other half. You notice something strange. One line is made of twisted wool. Not ideal, wool stretches, sags, and smells terrible when wet, but it was used in emergencies. And this line is blackened at one end. Burn marks. You wonder if it once held a torch, or if it was used during a lightning storm. Someone tied it into a complex knot that looks like a dragon swallowing its own tail. Knotwork, by the way, wasn't just practical. It was art. Intricate braids and loops, decorated handles, pouches, belts, even the ends of ship rigging. Not to impress anyone. Just because it looked right. Some knots were so complex that only one person in the village could tie them. Others were passed down, like recipes or curses. You sit for a moment beside a barrel half full of offcuts and failed splices. Each piece of rope tells a story. Some too short to be useful. Some frayed to fuzz. Some tied with strange, unfamiliar loops that make you wonder what their purpose ever was. Maybe they held down a sail. Maybe they dragged something heavy. Maybe they were meant to never be untied. The sun peeks through for a breathless moment, lighting the coil piles in warm gold. For a few seconds, the ropes shimmer like snakes in sleep. You imagine them waking, tightening, pulling, guiding a ship towards some unknown shore. Then the clouds return. The shimmer fades. The ropes remain. Still twisted. Still ready. You catch a whiff of something new now, sour, smoky, and strangely leathery. You follow the scent like a cartoon character in a trance, your feet crunching over a mess of broken reeds and scraps of hide, until you find the source. A low fire pit surrounded by steaming buckets, hunks of dark leather, and 3 people arguing over a nail. This is leak repair day. Again. Turns out that no matter how well a ship is built, the sea always finds a way in. And when it does, the Vikings don't call a plumber, they grab a hammer, a bucket of boiling leather, and a look of grim determination. You settle beside the fire. One of the shipwrights, bald, soot-smudged, and humming tunelessly, pulls a stiff, glistening square of hide from a steaming pot. It flaps like a pancake made from old boots. This is boiled leather, thickened by heat, stiffened by process, and used to patch cracks, holes, and seams the tar just couldn't fix. They called it cuir bouilli, though the Vikings likely had their own term. The concept was simple: soak rawhide in water, heat it slowly, not too much, or it warps, then press it onto wood. As it cooled, it hardened, clung, and sealed. Not pretty, but incredibly effective. The ship they're working on rocks gently on wooden braces, its belly exposed like some wounded beast. You see a jagged split near the keel, probably from hitting an ice shelf or a sneaky submerged rock. Either way, it's bleeding water. Time to bandage. One worker holds the leather in place while another drives in copper tacks. Not iron, they'll rust. These tacks are scavenged from scrap or hand-hammered from soft coins. The hammering rhythm is off today, a bit rushed. The fire flickers uncertainly. One man grumbles that this boat's cursed. The others ignore him. Maybe because he's right. Historians still argue how widespread leather patching really was. Some claim it was a last resort, used only when no proper wood was available. Others point to multiple shipwrecks with signs of leather sheathing, suggesting it was more common, just too humble to be mentioned in glorious tales of conquest and dragons. There's even debate over whether these repairs were always practical. One fragmentary saga describes a ship patched with a wolf's hide and the shield of a dead man. Was that poetic nonsense or a desperate field fix? Hard to say, but you kind of want it to be true. While the repair continues, another man kneels in the mud, carving replacement tacks from bone. His knife is sharp, and his hands never stop moving. He says nothing. You notice his left hand is wrapped in linen, likely from a hammer mishap or rope burn. He works through the pain. It's what you do. Not every hole gets leather. Some are plugged with wooden dowels soaked in resin, hammered in so tightly the hole squeals. Others are filled with oakum, a mash of tarred fibers and sheer optimism. It's shoved into gaps with a curved blade, packed tight, and sealed over with pine pitch. You step closer and watch the blade move, like dental work on a wooden jaw. One of the older shipwrights tells a story about a ship so riddled with holes they nicknamed it the Bucket. It made 6 successful raids. Why? Because they learned how to patch it faster than it could leak. Eventually, they sold it to the Danes. The Danes sank. Moral of the story? Don't name your boat anything that can't swim. The leather patch is finally secured. It sags a little at the corners. The crew adds an extra nail and mutters something that might be a prayer or a complaint about the weather. Either way, the job's done. The leak is sealed. Until the next one opens. You glance around and notice something else, scraps of boiled leather used for more than just repair. One's been folded into a pouch for nails. Another's tied around a broken R handle. One man's wearing strips of it as a shin guard. In a world without rubber, leather was your band-aid, your duct tape, your armor. It wasn't waterproof, not entirely, but it breathed, flexed, and held. And when soaked in wax or pitch, it became something close to invincible. Vikings didn't waste it. They boiled it, beat it, nailed it, and believed in it. Even if it smelled like wet barn on a good day. There's a moment of quiet now. The fire pops. The leather hisses as it cools. A gull screams overhead, offended by everything. You lean against a crate and take it all in, the patched hull, the muddy tools, the scattered footprints in the wet dirt. You realize then that Viking ship maintenance wasn't glamorous. It wasn't noble. It was sweaty, smelly, full of burns, splinters, and cracked knuckles. But it was sacred. Each fix was a promise. Not just to stay afloat, but to keep going. To outlast wind, wave, and wear. And as the last tack is driven home with a dull thud, you swear the ship exhales, just a little, like it knows it gets one more chance to sail. You're drawn now toward the most striking part of the Viking ship, the prow. Towering, curled, and sometimes snarling, it isn't just decoration. It's a declaration. A warning. A superstition carved in hardwood. And today, one is being born right in front of you. A group of woodcarvers crouch in a semicircle around a thick beam of oak, arguing over how mean the dragon should look. One wants the tongue sticking out. Another says that's bad luck unless you're sailing west. The third just keeps carving, as if letting the wood decide. Viking ships often had headposts, ornamental extensions of the bow carved into shapes both beautiful and terrifying. Dragons were most popular, of course. But there were also wolves, serpents, seahorses, and the occasional grim face with bulging eyes. The idea? Scare away evil spirits. Or rival ships. Or both, if you did it right. You crouched beside the lead carver, a wiry man with a braided beard and a scar shaped like a sideways fishhook. His chisel moves like it's alive. Shaving by shaving, he pulls the creature out of the wood grain. Its eye is already fierce. Its jaw curls like it's snarling at the wind. Some say these figures were removed before returning home, especially if the ship came back from a raid or burial voyage. You didn't want to frighten your local spirits. Or provoke envy from the gods. Historians still argue about whether these removals were ritualistic, practical, or just a way to recycle fancy lumber. The man carving next to him is working on something smaller, a stern post shaped like a serpent, thin and graceful. Ships sometimes had matching prows and sterns, like mirrored bookends gliding across the sea. Other times, the back was plain. Depends on the purpose. A merchant ship? Probably no fangs. A raiding ship? Fangs required. The tools are simple, chisels, knives, mallets. Some are bone-handled, passed down through generations. The designs? More complex. Spirals. Knots. Interwoven animals. Patterns that seem to loop into themselves forever. One panel features a lion biting its own tail. Another shows two ravens locked in a dance of wings and teeth. You ask, silently, of course, if this is just art. One carver grins and points to a pile of carved panels. Among them is a stylized pig with wings, and a bearded face that looks suspiciously like a local blacksmith. So, yes, some carvings are jokes. Others are stories. One figurehead from a half-finished ship seems to be a bear wearing a crown and looking deeply unimpressed. You suspect someone lost a bet. But mostly, these carvings had meaning. To the crew, to the sea, and to the ship itself. A dragon on the prow meant fierceness, sure. But it also meant vigilance. A guardian. A beast to watch the waves ahead, to keep the ship on course. There's a theory, whispered more than written, that each figurehead had to be fed before a long voyage. Not food. Just a few drops of blood. Maybe wine. Maybe both. Just enough to remind it what it was guarding. You glance up at the nearly finished dragon. It's almost alive now. Its scales are shallow ridges running along the spine, its eyes deep-set and slightly asymmetrical. Whether by accident or design, it gives the impression the beast is always watching you, even when you move. The youngest carver adds the final detail, a small spiral etched just beneath the chin. A personal signature, or maybe a prayer. He steps back. The others nod. No applause. Just a quiet, collective agreement that the ship now has a face. And it does. Ships had names, too. Not written in paint or banners, usually just whispered between crew. The Whale Killer, Storm Dancer, Frost Sister. The names weren't always logical. One famed ship was reportedly named Quiet Goat. Historians still debate whether that was irony or black humor. Or both. You imagine a storm now, wind howling, waves hammering, sail flapping like a banner of defiance. And at the prow, this dragon, drenched, dark, roaring into the gale without making a sound. It's more than just wood. It's the personality of the ship. The soul. And every crew member knows it. One of the older men leans on his chisel and says, "Not to you but to no one in particular. You trust the prow like you trust the tide. You don't argue. You follow." Then he sneezes, loudly, and ruins the moment. The dragon head is lifted now by 4 men and walked to the ship. It's lashed in place temporarily, waiting for the final bolts. But already, it seems to belong. The ship stands straighter somehow. Sharper. Like it just remembered who it was. And you? You realize that even in a world of mud, tar, and hard labor, beauty mattered. Fear mattered. Identity mattered. The prow wasn't just for show. It was a promise. That if the sea tried to take this ship, it would have to get past the dragon first. The ship's dragon prow looms behind you now, still drying, still watching, as you step towards something even stranger, navigation. How did Vikings find their way across endless gray water without getting hopelessly lost, eaten by sea monsters, or accidentally discovering Canada a few centuries too early? You stroll past the mast stump of an older vessel, where a man is crouched with a half-open chest at his feet. Inside? Bits of polished stone, a greasy scrap of leather with notches carved into it, and what appears to be a very grumpy goose tied to a post. Welcome to Viking navigation. Forget compasses, they didn't use them. Instead, Vikings relied on a mix of observation, instinct, and sheer oceanic boldness. They used sunstones, birds, the color of the water, the shape of the waves, and yes, sometimes, goose intestines. One saga even implies that a captain once turned back from a voyage because a whale gave him the wrong look. Historians still argue whether that line was metaphorical, hallucinatory, or just an early case of seasick anxiety. The sunstone is your first curiosity. It's pale, milky, almost translucent, a chunk of Iceland spar. When held up to the cloudy sky, it splits light and reveals the sun's direction, even when overcast. You hold one up and squint. Yep! Still loss. But to someone with practice, this was as good as a compass. Maybe better. It never demagnetized, and you couldn't drop it in the bilge and blame the raven. Ah yes, the raven. Another ancient method, release a raven from your ship. If it circles and returns, land isn't close. If it flies off in a straight line, follow it. Unless it turns around halfway through and decides your lunch. One carving shows a man throwing a raven with a dramatic flourish. You suspect the bird did not enjoy the performance. Then there's the sea itself. Vikings could read it. The wave patterns, the swell direction, even the color told them where they were. Lighter green water meant shallows. Darker blue, deeper seas. They'd toss a weighted rope, called a sounding line, overboard to measure depth, and sometimes pull up mud to sniff. Yes, sniff. Different coastal areas smelled different. This was cartography by nose. And the stars? Oh, they used them too, but mostly in clear weather, and mostly closer to shore. Navigating by Polaris, the North Star, was helpful, but only if you could see it and hadn't just spent 2 days rowing in circles while hallucinating a floating walrus god. You nod in understanding. We've all been there. Metaphorically. One navigator shows you his leather chart. It's not a map, not really. It's a timeline, a story. A series of notches and symbols marking sailing days, resting days, and landmarks like the rock shaped like a troll's nose or where we found the seal with 3 eyes. Extremely useful if you were on that voyage. Less so if you weren't. They also used what's now called a solar compass, a small wooden disc with markings that used the sun's shadow to estimate direction. Simple, brilliant, and shockingly accurate, assuming the sun behaved and you didn't drop it overboard while sneezing. You sit beside the man now untangling the goose. He explains that sometimes a goose's gut lining was examined before voyages. Cloudy meant trouble. Clear meant smooth sailing. This wasn't standard procedure, and he admits it didn't always work. One time, the gut was crystal clear, and they ended up trapped in ice for 5 days. He still blames the goose. You're starting to see the pattern here. Viking navigation wasn't a science, it was a mix of practice, tradition, signs, and a bit of daring bravado. They didn't know exactly where they were, but they knew enough. They knew how to trust the sea, and more importantly, how to read it like a story told in salt and sky. Some sailors kept mental sea books, narratives passed from ship to ship. Sailed 2 days past the whale grounds, then 3 mornings after the blue cliffs, turn where the seagulls gather. It wasn't poetic. It was precise, if you knew what to look for. If you didn't, well, say hi to Greenland. Or a rock. There's even evidence, historians still debate how much, that Viking navigators used crude tide charts, memorized by heart. Knowing when currents reversed or when fog was thickest could mean the difference between a clean beach landing and a hole full of seawater and sand. You glance up now. The sky is thick with clouds. Somewhere beyond them is the sun, the wind, the stories told in whitecaps and bird calls. The navigator beside you ties a final knot in his sail string and nods to no one in particular. The ship is almost ready. The dragon watches. The ropes hold. The fat is sealed. And thanks to sunstones, birds, and a little goose-related guesswork, you might even know which way is home. You step carefully now through the damp grass beyond the shipyard, where the sounds of work fade, and something quieter lingers in the air. This place feels heavier, slower, and as you pass through the half-collapsed wooden gate, you understand why. You've entered a ship graveyard. These aren't full ships, not anymore. Just outlines in the soil. Half-buried timbers. Curved ribs of oak sticking out like the bones of some long-dead sea beast. Moss grows in the seams. Birds perch on the frames. It's peaceful, but also eerie, like the sea itself came here to whisper to the past. Some of these vessels were laid to rest on purpose. Viking ship burials weren't just about death. They were about memory, identity, and legacy. A chieftain might be placed inside a ship filled with offerings, swords, drinking horns, even sacrificed animals, then buried under a mound or burned in a blaze of smoke and flame. Most people picture the fire, but the mound burial was far more common, more practical, more permanent. You kneel by one burial mound, its edges ringed with stones. If you squint, you can still see the curved shape of a hole underneath. This one was modest, no gold, no glamour, but important enough to be remembered. A warrior? A sailor? A mother who once rode farther than anyone expected? No one carved a name. The idea was simple. In death, the journey didn't end. The ship carried you onward, to Valhalla, to hell, to somewhere quieter, perhaps. Your body rested in the hole, surrounded by goods, guarded by your own memories. The ship was your coffin, your horse, your story. But not all ships here were burials. Some are just abandoned, retired, sunk in place when too damaged to sail but too beloved to destroy. Their planks were patched too many times. Their keels were split. Or they were simply replaced by newer builds, faster, sharper, less splintery. So they were dragged ashore, tilted onto their sides, and left to fade. You run your fingers along one such hole. It's gray now, soft with rot, but you can still see the lines of the craftsmanship. Pegs. Joints. A faint carving of a knotwork spiral. No one touches it anymore, except time. There's a theory, yes, another one, that Vikings believed ships had souls. Not metaphorically, but truly. And when a ship had given all it could, it needed to rest. That's why some weren't dismantled or burned. They were left alone, allowed to sink slowly into the earth like old warriors bowing out of the saga. You pause beside a long groove in the dirt. Nothing remains of the ship, just the shape it left behind. A shadow of timbers. Someone planted flowers here, purple ones, tiny and brave. Whether it's a tribute or just convenient gardening, no one knows. Nearby, a boy sharpens a knife on a rock while his grandmother tells him stories. She points at one of the mounds. That one, she says, held our father's ship. He sailed it for 20 years. Came home with silver, arrows, and more stories than anyone wanted. When he died, they filled the boat with his boots, his shield, and a sack of rocks from every shore he touched. The boy listens, wide-eyed, then goes back to sharpening. The knife needs to be ready. So does he. Some parts of these old ships are reused, beams become barns, planks become fences, even carved prow figures end up in temples or over doorways. But not always. Some are left whole. Because once a ship has crossed certain waters, you don't tear it apart. You let it sleep. You find a half-buried nail glinting in the mud. Iron, slightly bent. You hold it for a moment. Maybe it once held a seam together during a storm. Maybe it rattled loose while the crew sang over the waves. Now it lies here, content, no longer needed. You set it back down. There's one ship still mostly intact. The hull is shattered, but the prow remains, leaning sideways, moss-covered, but unmistakable. A wolf's head, mouth open in eternal howl. Someone tied a string of beads around its snout, maybe recently. Maybe not. You don't ask. Historians still argue whether these ship graveyards were planned or accidental. Did the Vikings mean for these places to become sacred? Or did they just end up this way, because people couldn't bear to burn what had once carried them through storm and glory? The debate continues, but the ships are silent. They don't explain. They just exist. You walk slowly through the rows, each step softer than the last. The wind hushes here. Even the birds lower their voices. It's not sadness that lingers, but reverence. The kind of quiet you offer to anything that's endured more than it should have. The shipbuilders down by the shore are still hammering. New holes are being patched, fat brushed on, ropes tied. But up here, on this gentle rise above the fjord, old ships rest. Their stories are told now in the way the grass grows, the way the wood creaks in the wind, the way children are still warned not to run on the mounds. Because these aren't just graves. They're echoes. You leave the ship graveyard behind as the wind picks up, cold and sharp like a blade licked by frost. It whistles between the half-built hulls, rattles loose sails on drying lines, and bites at your fingers no matter how deep you stuff them into imaginary pockets. It's winter here, or at least close enough for the world to start freezing around the edges. And if there's one thing Viking ships hated almost as much as shipworms, it was ice. You find a crew huddled around a fire beneath the tilted frame of a cargo boat. The air smells like pine smoke and damp wool. One man is hammering at a plank that's split right down the middle. The others are muttering about frost. And ale. And how the frost ruined the ale. You nod in sympathy. That's a tragedy in any century. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Viking ships were built for rough seas, but wood is still wood. Freeze it too fast and it cracks. Especially the joints, where tar had hardened and seams had already been stretched by waves. The expansion of ice in those seams could split a perfectly sealed hull, turning a seaworthy vessel into a glorified ice tray. To prevent that, they had a few tricks. Ships were often hauled out of the water during the harshest months, stored in dry sheds or propped up near fire pits to keep the worst of the frost at bay. The tar was rechecked constantly, sometimes reheated and rubbed in again just to make sure it stayed flexible. Cracks were packed with moss soaked in resin. And if none of that worked, you crossed your fingers, said something rude about Thor's breath, and hoped spring came early. You watch as one builder unwraps a bundle of rags to reveal a barrel. It sloshes when he moves it. Ale. Not for drinking. Not this time. He dips a cloth in and begins rubbing it along the edge of a plank. Ale, it turns out, had more uses than just morale. Low-alcohol brews were used to soften hardened tar, thaw frozen seams, and disinfect minor injuries. It was also warm when heated, which made it a favorite for dipping tools, or numbing cold fingers. There's a joke here somewhere about beer being structural, and you almost say it aloud. But then one of the men holds up a cracked rib beam, swears at it under his breath, and dumps half a mug of warm ale onto the break. Science? Maybe not. But if belief and habit got you through a Norwegian winter, you didn't ask too many questions. A younger worker drags a fur over the tiller of one half-frozen vessel. The wood creaks when he touches it, swollen from moisture, stiff from cold. He rubs it gently, like coaxing life back into an old friend. His breath clouds in the air. The ship doesn't speak, but something in its groan sounds grateful. There's also a fringe belief, historians still debate its seriousness, that coating the ship with a layer of goat butter before winter storage helped repel frost and snow. Whether it worked or just attracted dogs, no one's quite sure. One saga fragment describes a crew slipping like fish on their own goat-smeared deck. Cautionary tale or slapstick moment? Hard to say. You suspect both. You glance at the frozen ground and notice a small pile of shattered wooden pegs. These were hammered in earlier, then forced apart by the freeze. They splintered like glass. The repairmen don't even flinch. They just start over. Winter always wins the first few rounds. But Vikings play the long game. Nearby, a man squats beside a fire and holds a loop of rope over the flames. Not too close. Just enough to thaw it. Frozen ropes become stiff and brittle, more like sticks than lines. And if they snap during a sail raise, someone loses more than a finger. The heat softens the fibers. The smell of singed hemp joins the cold air like a ghost of summer. It wasn't all disaster, though. Frozen harbors sometimes made repairs easier. With the ship stable on thick ice, some whole work could be done without hauling it out or building braces. You imagine the crunch of footsteps on frozen fjord, the hammer strikes echoing off ice, the risk of a thaw always waiting just beneath your boots. And yet, ships survived. Some even thrived. Cold preserved the tar, kept rot at bay, and scared off shipworms. It was a balancing act. Too much cold and the boat cracked. Too little, and decay crept in. Maintenance wasn't a seasonal job. It was a year-round commitment that involved weather watching, guesswork, and a lot of warm drinks that may or may not have included herbs you're not allowed to name in polite company. You linger by a hole covered in frost. Someone's traced a rune in the white layer with their finger, a simple spiral. A wish? A message? Just something to pass the time? You don't know. But it makes the boat look alive again, just for a moment. Then the wind shifts. Colder now. Sharper. The men pull their cloaks tighter and move back to the fire. One throws a piece of pitch-soaked rope into the flames. It flares green and gold, lighting the frosty ribs of the ship behind them like stained glass. And beneath it all, that cracked plank still holds. A little beer. A little fire. A little belief. Viking winter engineering at its finest. The cold's not going anywhere, but neither are you. Not when you hear laughter drifting across the shipyard, unexpected, bright, the kind of sound that slices through fog like an axe through ice. You follow it until you see them, a group of women gathered around a half-loaded supply boat, arms full of sacks and shields, arguing about where to stash the dried fish. Yes, women. You're not sure why you're surprised. Maybe all the old stories made you think Viking ships were boys-only clubs, filled with beards, blood, and bad breath. But here they are, daughters, sisters, wives, warriors, merchants, loading gear, packing supplies, patching sails. This isn't a special occasion. This is daily life. One woman is lashing a chest shut with thick rope. Another sharpens a seeks with slow, deliberate strokes. A third climbs into the ship's hold, ducks out of sight, then pops back up with a glare and a boot in her hand. Apparently, someone left it in a flour barrel. Again, there's a reason this scene isn't more famous, because it complicates things. The sagas give us shield maidens and seafaring queens, but how common were they, really? Historians still argue whether Viking women sailed often or only under rare, dramatic circumstances. But recent archaeology? It's telling a different story. Graves of women buried with weapons, tools for navigation, rings and brooches from far-off lands. One woman buried aboard a boat in Sweden, surrounded by horses and silk. This isn't just symbolism. These were travelers, traders, possibly raiders. Definitely part of the crew. You sit near one who's mending a seam in a leather sack. Her hands are quick, practiced, and tar-streaked. She doesn't look like someone pretending. She looks like someone who's done this 100 times. Another woman nearby, taller and broader than most of the men, hoists a barrel onto her shoulder and mutters that if the storm hits before they set out, she's swimming to Denmark and leaving the rest of them to figure it out. No one questions her. She's probably done it before. And this wasn't limited to repairs or errands. Some women captained ships. Others fought. Not all, of course. Plenty stayed ashore, kept farms, raised children, spun the sails. But the idea of the passive Viking housewife? That's more myth than reality. Life was too hard, the sea too greedy, for anyone to sit on the sidelines. You overhear a girl asking her mother how to aim an arrow from a moving boat. The mother doesn't laugh. She demonstrates, using a coil of rope and an old piece of dried meat as a target. The arrow misses. They both cheer anyway. There's a quiet authority in the way these women move. Not performative. Just capable. They've built ships, rowed them, navigated storms, hauled goods up icy hills while the men were still arguing about sail angle. One woman points to the prow figurehead and says, "That's new." He looks scared. The others laugh, but she's not wrong. Still, there's debate. Some say women aboard ships were rare, exceptions tied to special missions or desperate voyages. Others argue they were always there, just not recorded by the men who wrote the stories later. And some, of course, say it depends on which coast, which clan, which storm. But the evidence grows. Not just graves and tools, but stories. Passed down in kitchens, over campfires, during long, freezing nights when the sea was too rough and the meat was almost gone. Stories of women who held the rudder when no one else could. Who threw the first spear. Who sang the loudest into the wind. One woman nearby hums softly as she packs her gear. It's a lullaby, simple, haunting. You can't understand the words, but the melody feels like seawater on skin. Like memories you didn't know you had. There's an old saying, the sea doesn't care who you are, only how well you row. And here, under the pale sky, among half-mended sails and soggy boots, you understand what that means. No one's giving speeches. No one's waiting for permission. They're just working. And when the time comes, when the sail is raised and the tide pulls clean, they'll be there, too. At the oar. At the helm. At the bow, shouting into the storm with their hair braided tight and their boots strapped down hard. Because the sea doesn't ask. It takes. And only those who are ready, regardless of who they are, get to take something back. The scent hits you first, a wave of sour sweat, sun-drenched wool, and something suspiciously like very old yogurt. You turn toward the cluster of ships pulled onto the rocks for final inspection and realize, this is what a Viking ship truly smells like. Forget the heroic sagas. Forget the gleaming ships cutting clean lines across the ocean. Get close enough, and you'll meet the real crew: mildew, fish oil, smoked meat, wet leather, seaweed, feet, and, yes, fermented dairy. You're not sure whether to gag or be impressed. Viking ships were masterpieces of engineering. But hygiene? Let's just say they prioritized survival over citrus freshness. You step aboard one moored close to shore. The deck creaks beneath your feet, still damp from last night's rain. Someone has hung a pair of dripping boots near the mast, with a small pine branch stuffed inside each. Viking air freshener, apparently. The gesture is appreciated, if not entirely effective. You move toward the central deck, where cargo nets are piled high with supplies: salted fish, dried meat, hard bread, and sacks of cheese curds. One of them is leaking slightly. No one seems concerned. In fact, one man is poking it with a knife to check if it's still edible. His friend assures him that if it stinks, it's just starting to get good. The smell is overwhelming, a swirling cocktail of human effort and marine persistence. Wool blankets, soaked in seawater, then dried over smoky fires, smell like they've been worn by particularly emotional sheep. Rope tangles reek of pitch and old brine. Helmets and mail, when not recently oiled, begin to develop their own personality. There's a fringe belief, historians still debate how seriously it was taken, that certain smells were thought to protect sailors from sea spirits. Strong cheese, garlic, or goat fat might ward off misfortune. Or simply ward off crew members you didn't like. One sailor, sitting cross-legged beside a bucket, is rubbing a mixture of goat butter and herbs into the seams between deck planks. It keeps the wood supple, he says. Also keeps the insects away. You ask if it works. He shrugs. The bugs still show up, but they don't stay long. Above him, the sail is being rehoisted. The wool's darkened with age, streaked from tar and ash. When the wind catches it, the whole ship seems to exhale. And with it comes another blast of salty, sweaty, oily air. It's not awful, just honest. Every scent tells a story. The crew smells like their work. That's the simplest way to put it. Fishers carry the ocean with them. Warriors reek of iron and leather. The cook smells like smoke and onions and whatever went wrong at breakfast. Even the ship's dog, yes, there's one aboard, smells like wet bark and old bones. It sniffs your leg, sneezes, and walks off, unimpressed. One young boy is scrubbing the deck with sand and seawater. It's the closest thing to soap they have. He hums as he works, splashing more water than necessary, leaving trails of foam and fish scales in his wake. When he's done, the boards are marginally cleaner, but now the ship smells like low tide. Progress? Some try to manage it. Bundles of herbs are hung below deck, lavender, juniper, whatever grows nearby. One woman has sewn small pouches of dried mint into her tunic lining. Another has braided fresh spruce needles into her hair. Not just for smell, she says, it keeps the lice away. Probably. The cooking fire doesn't help. Smoked fish, boiled grain, and goat stew simmer together into a scent that settles deep into the ship's timbers. It will never fully come out. Decades from now, that wood will still remember what dinner smelled like. You sit for a moment on a low bench near the stern. The wind shifts again, blowing the worst of the smell back toward shore. For a second, all you can smell is the sea, clean, cold, and vast. Then a crewman walks past with a sack of fermented herring, and the spell is broken. And yet, it's all part of the experience. This isn't a cruise ship. It's a floating village. A tool. A beast of burden. And yes, a beast with very questionable hygiene. The smell means the ship is alive. Being used. Being trusted. Every cent is earned through rowing, patching, steering, cursing. It's a record of survival written in sweat and smoke. So the next time someone romanticizes Viking voyages, picture this: 30 men and women, shoulder to shoulder, soaked and sunburned, eating pickled fish in their wool socks, while the ship beneath them smells like a cross between a cheese cellar and a campfire. And somehow, they loved it. Because it meant they were going somewhere. By now, you've grown strangely fond of the shipyard's smells and rhythms, tar bubbling, ropes creaking, sails groaning like tired lungs. But today, you're drawn below decks. Into the dark. Into the bilge. Yes, the bilge. The lowest, dampest, smelliest part of the ship. Where seawater gathers. Where tools get dropped and vanish forever. Where things grow that you really, really don't want to name. And yet, it's where you discover something unexpected. Runes. You duck beneath the low crossbeams of a half-finished vessel, careful not to crack your skull. It's quiet down here, save for the drip-drip of moisture falling from the seams above. The wood glistens in patches, glows faintly amber in the flickering firelight from above. And there, carved into the inside of a beam, barely above the bilge line, is a tiny row of runes. They aren't large or decorative. Not like the ones on grave markers or jewelry. These are scratchy, cramped, almost hidden. You lean closer. They read something like, "Thor owns this board. Touch it and drown." Charming. Vikings loved their runes. They carved them into tools, weapons, combs, spoons. And, as you're now learning, ship interiors. These weren't just words. They were part superstition, part graffiti, part code. A message to the gods, or to crewmates, or to no one in particular. Maybe just boredom. One theory, historians still argue this, is that shipbuilders left runes as a way to anchor the ship's spirit. Like a birth certificate. Others think it was a form of claim, this plank is mine. Still others say it was all jokes and curses, the medieval version of writing "Don't sit here on your favorite bench." You move along the beam and find another carving, a face. Round, cartoonish, tongue sticking out. Next to it, a few more runes. A rough translation? Gunnar rose like a goat. Classic. Above your head, a beam has a more solemn inscription. 3 runes, spaced wide, Uras, Rado, Algiz. Strength, journey, protection. You can almost feel the intent in the lines. The ship's builder wanted this place blessed, not by a priest, but by the tools in his own hands. Sometimes the runes were poetic. A fragment on a shattered plank reads, "The weight has teeth but the keel is bone." Not bad, honestly. Other times, they were pure utility. One short line scratched into a bulkhead simply says, "Fix this later." Spoiler, no one ever did. One sailor once carved tally marks into a beam to count the number of leaks he patched. When the ship was recovered centuries later, the marks were still there, dozens of them. A whole life of sloshing water and muttered curses, recorded in hash marks and rust stains. A few feet away, there's a hollow in the wood, carefully chiseled into a shallow bowl. Someone's placed a bone charm inside it. A boar's tooth, smoothed from years of handling. Whether it was meant to protect the ship or the sailor who hid it, no one knows. But it's been there a long time. You hear footsteps above, someone walking the deck, and feel the faint vibration through the ribs of the ship. It's like being inside a sleeping creature. The wood breathes, shifts, groans. The runes remain, and they weren't always for human eyes. Some runes were placed where only the gods, or the sea, could read them. Inside seams. under benches, even on the underside of the prow, where the dragon's tongue met the spray. Messages lost to the waves, whispered into salt and silence. You crawl toward the rear bulkhead and find one final carving. A snake, coiled tight, its tail in its mouth. Beside it, a single word, Siger. Victory. Simple. Hopeful. A wish made in darkness. Up above, someone drops a tool. It clangs loudly, and you jerk your head, smacking it on a beam. The runes remain unimpressed. You crawl back out, blinking into the light. The ship is loud again, hammers ringing, ropes creaking, laughter rising. But below, in the dark belly of the boat, 1,000 quiet messages wait. Not all of them are kind. Not all of them are brave. But every one of them is true. Because when you carve something into a ship, something permanent, it means you want it remembered. Even if it's just that Gunnar rose like a goat. The firelight's dimmer now, the sun barely making it past the edges of the fjord. But there's one more place calling your name. Past the drying nets and the glistening ropes, beyond the idle chatter and smoke, you find a group of men and women kneeling around the hull of a newly finished ship. They're not caulking. They're not carving. They're offering. Yes, offering. A small bowl of ale. A carved bone rune. A smear of butter. A feather, a stone, even a tiny doll woven from straw. All laid gently against the keel, just beneath where the ship's spine curves toward the sea. It's quiet here. Reverent. No one jokes. No one hammers. No one spits. This isn't about repair. It's about ritual. You've heard whispers of it all day, haven't you? The blessing of the first nail. The charm in the bilge. The dragon on the prow watching the wind. These ships weren't just transport, they were companions. Beings with names and tempers and needs. And before they met the sea, they had to be honored. One woman dips her fingers into the ale and flicks it onto the hull with a whispered word. You don't catch the language. Maybe it's just her family's. Maybe it's older. She touches the keel once, then walks away without looking back. There's a theory, one that gives modern historians headaches, that Viking shipbuilders didn't separate the practical from the spiritual. There were no secular ships. Everything built to touch the sea had to be seen, felt, and spoken to as if it were alive. And to be alive, you had to be noticed. Odin, Njord, Ran, Ager, the gods of sea and storm and fate. Some offerings were for them. Some were for the ship itself. Some? Just in case. When you sail into the unknown, it doesn't hurt to cover all bases. One sailor once buried his own hair under the mast base of every ship he served on. Another carved a face into the rudder post, so the ship could see where it was going. A third insisted every voyage start with one drop of blood in the sea. Just a pinprick. Just to let the ocean know you weren't arrogant. You walk slowly around the vessel, noticing tiny things, a knot of wool tied to a nailhead, a smear of red ochre painted in a spiral, a single coin wedged between the planks. These aren't random. They're memory. Identity. A way to say this ship belongs to us, and we belong to it. One boy, no more than 12, walks up with a carved fish on a string. He hesitates, then ties it to a nail and pats the hole. The others don't laugh. The gesture is pure. You suspect this is his first voyage. The sea, they say, remembers the first time it sees you. And the last. The line between maintenance and magic is thin here. Was that layer of tar just for waterproofing, or was it applied clockwise because that's the way the sun turns? Did the mast creak because it was settling, or because it didn't like the helmsman's song? Better safe than sunk. There's a carved wooden pole standing upright beside the ship. It's old, cracked, and covered in runes that have long since faded. Someone has hung a leather pouch from it, possibly full of herbs, possibly old crumbs. Either way, it sways gently in the wind. Watching. You crouch by the hull and press your hand to the wood. It's warm from the day's sun, smooth from months of shaping, sticky in places with tar. You imagine the first wave hitting it, the groan of the timbers as they flex, the shiver of ropes, the sudden, deep breath a ship seems to take when it finally leaves land. And for all the sawdust and sweat and smashed fingers it took to build it, this quiet moment matters just as much. There's even a story, half truth, half warning, about a ship that sank on its first voyage because the builders forgot to name it. Just pushed it into the sea with no rites, no offerings, no music. The waves took it instantly. No survivors. From then on, even if the name was never spoken aloud, it was whispered to the hull. Because a ship without a name is just driftwood waiting to happen. You stand now, the breeze brushing your face, the stars blinking into view above the fjord. The ship gleams in the fading light, newly born, freshly blessed. It isn't sailing yet, but it will. And when it does, it will carry every touch, every word, every odd little token pressed into its grain. Because to the Vikings, sailing wasn't just movement. It was a conversation with the gods. The fjord is quiet now, winds stilled, lanterns low, only the soft thump of waves against the hulls keeping time like a heartbeat under blankets. But just when you think everything's packed, polished, and prepared, someone throws a log onto the fire and calls for help. Not to sail, to recycle. The ship leaning near the water's edge isn't going anywhere. Its keel is cracked. Half the ribs are splintered. The dragon head has been removed and now serves as the decorative end of a chicken perch. No one's sad. Well, maybe a little. But mostly, they're practical. Because old ships don't just disappear. They become other things. You watch as two men and a woman begin to strip the vessel down. Nails are pried free and sorted into a leather pouch. Rope is coiled, tested for rot, and bundled for drying. One boy carries off a pair of oars, still solid. They'll likely be used for a smaller boat, or maybe cut into handles for tools. Nothing is wasted. One by one, the planks come off. You hear the groan of iron against wood, the snap of dried pitch breaking its seal. Underneath, there's moss, and a surprising number of dead beetles. The crew brushes it all aside without comment. Then come the ribs, those curved inner bones that once gave the ship its shape. They're not thrown out. They're carefully stacked. Some will become furniture. Others, rafters. One particularly long, slightly twisted one is declared perfect for a sled. Someone marks it with chalk. You overhear a man say, "The best barn I've ever seen was built from a ship." And he's right. You've seen it. Farther inland, old ships get reborn. Their beams prop up longhouses. Their planks line cold storage rooms. Even their tar is scraped, reheated, and reused to seal window frames or patch animal pens. There's a fringed tale, historians still scoff, but admit it's charming, about a sled built from an old warship that outran every other in the valley. Some say it was cursed. Others say it just remembered how to move. Either way, it carried 3 barrels of herring and a farmer named Snorri all the way to market in half the usual time. You peer into the remains of the hull and notice one of the ribs is carved with runes. Faint, faded. Possibly a blessing. Possibly someone's name. It's hard to tell. But the carver takes a moment, running his thumb over the lines, before moving on. You understand. Just because a ship's done sailing doesn't mean it's forgotten. Some parts are too damaged to salvage. These go to the fire. Not thrown in carelessly, stacked. Burned slowly. The scent of salt and pitch fills the air, blending with pine smoke. It smells like endings. Like memory. Like the inside of a dream you don't want to wake from. A girl nearby is weaving rope around one of the smaller pieces of curved plank. She says it'll be a cradle. The wood has travel in it, she explains. Good for sleep. You believe her. Even the nails, bent and rusted, find new lives. Some are reforged. Others hammered into doors, fence posts, walking sticks. A Viking blacksmith once said that old iron remembers its shape, and if you forge it into something new without thanking it first, it might just snap when you least expect it. And so, around the shipyard, ghosts of ships linger. A bench made from a rudder. A gate bound with prow nails. A lintel made from a mast. You start to see it now, everywhere. The sea doesn't leave things behind. It just changes their shape. There's a saying among the older builders, every ship becomes a house. Every house becomes a cart. Every cart becomes a spoon. It's not literal. But then again, it kind of is. You help carry one last board to a stack near the longhouse. It creaks as you set it down. Not from weight, but from age. A final sigh. Maybe relief. Maybe gratitude. It won't see another storm. But it'll hold up a roof. Or shelter a goat. Or carry a child across snow. And that's something. Because to the Vikings, endings weren't failures. They were just quieter kinds of voyages. The wind settles into a hush now. Not silence, just something gentler. The fires are mostly out, their embers glowing low like sleepy eyes. The shipyard is quieted, the laughter dimmed, the work tools tucked away in bundles of rope and canvas. You find yourself back near the water's edge, where one final longship rocks gently in the shallows. It's done. The fat has been rubbed, the seams tarred, the figurehead bolted in place. The ropes hang in neat coils, smelling of salt and smoke and effort. And standing around it are those who built it, wrinkled hands and young ones, streaked with soot and pitch, faces tired and proud and ready. Somewhere behind you, a drum taps slowly, just once. Then again. A rhythm older than anyone present. Not loud, not grand, just enough to signal, it's time. A horn sounds, not one of war, but of motion, low and resonant. A dozen hands push. The ship resists, then shifts. With scrapes against stone. Water splashes. The hull glides forward, slow at first, then eager. Like it remembers. You wade ankle deep and press your hand to the wet timber as it passes. It's cold. Alive. Somehow still humming from all the days and nights of work. It doesn't thank you. It doesn't need to. Someone tosses a sprig of pine onto the deck. Another throws a pinch of salt. One girl murmurs a name, not the ship's, but someone's. A brother, perhaps. A promise. A whisper to be carried by the wind. The longship slides out toward open water, still tethered but bobbing now with purpose. You watch it sway, as if breathing, as if listening, as if deciding what kind of story it wants to become. A man beside you lights a tiny torch and traces a circle in the air, then flicks the flame into the sea. The light vanishes. The circle remains. And as the last plank vanishes into shadow, you feel it, the slow fade of energy. The shift from building to waiting. From work to dreaming. Now the shipyard rests. The wood cools. The pitch sets. The fat stiffens in the seams. And overhead, the stars blinken, one by one, like nails in a roof meant to keep out the dark. Word count, 1070. Wind down, 300 words. So now, you can let your breath slow. Let your body sink into the mattress, the blanket, the quiet hum of whatever surrounds you. The ships are built. The ropes are tied. The fires are low and crackling only in memory now. You've walked through tar pits and rope sheds, crouched beside sunstones and sea-soaked sails, peeked into bilges carved with private runes. You've watched women row, men scrape barnacles with fish bones, children patch holes with more determination than skill. You've heard laughter, heard prayers, heard would speak when the nails went in just right. And all of it, every messy, beautiful detail, was done for one reason, to carry someone forward. That's the legacy of the Viking ship. Not conquest. Not gold. But movement. Hope. The belief that there is always somewhere to go, even if you don't yet know how far the sea stretches, or what waits beyond the mist. And now you, too, can drift. You don't have to row. You don't have to steer. Just imagine that your breath is the tide, your heartbeat the oar. Let it carry you where it will. The dragon on the prow will keep watch. The ropes will hold. The sea is calm tonight. You're already halfway there.